Everything around the war in Ukraine right now has to be viewed through the lens of the pending Ukrainian counteroffensive. From Russian missile attacks that are maybe a little less than expected, to Prigozhin freaking out a bit in Bakhmut, to Ukrainian drone attacks in Crimea, and apparently now the Kremlin. I was putting this video together when news came out that Russia shot down 2 drones over the Kremlin, which is a significant development. There's lots of unknowns still there, but it does tie into something that I was planning on talking to in this video. Ukraine's newest deep strike capability that really isn't getting much attention at all. Over the last few weeks, there's been a significant increase in deep strikes by both sides, at least compared to the last few months. Back in October, shortly after the Kerch Bridge was attacked, Russia kicked off a substantial aerial campaign against Ukraine. This largely took the form of missile and drone attacks launched from inside of Russian territory, Belarus, and the Black Sea. Given that this was just before winter took hold, there was an argument that Russia was targeting the Ukrainian energy grid in an attempt to freeze out the population over the coming months. Now, that didn't really happen, but in the process, a lot of civilian infrastructure was destroyed. Then it stopped, or at least slowed for quite a while. At its peak, there were drone and missile attacks against Ukrainian population centers daily, but that hasn't been the case for a few months now. As of late, this tends to be one barrage, 10 to 20 munitions every 2 to 3 weeks. This can be interpreted a few ways. The first is that Russia recognized that the previous campaign wasn't working and rather than double down, decided to move in a different direction. Now, to keep Ukrainian air defense focused further from the front lines, Russia still needs to lob a few missiles every few weeks, but that fixing style operation can be accomplished with fewer missiles and fewer drones. That argument would play out that Russia is saving their ammunition for another purpose. We have seen reports of this when it comes to artillery ammunition. Over the last couple weeks, there have been reports that the volume of fire has reduced over a few areas of the front, with the belief that it's likely being stored to counter whatever Ukraine throws at the Russian lines. It's possible that's the same strategy when it comes to Russian missiles and drones. The other side of that argument is that Russia would like to continue bombarding Ukraine, but they don't have the capacity to do so. Some of the missiles used in recent attacks were noted to have been manufactured in the last year. Again, there's a bit of speculation needed here. Would Russia use their newest stuff first, or the older stock that's been sitting aside for years? There's a lot that goes into that analysis, and simply noting that new missiles are being fired doesn't automatically mean that Russia is running low on those munitions, but it does raise that conversation. Then an event this week that can play into either side of that debate was a missile attack on May 1st. Accounts on Telegram and Twitter were going crazy talking about the number of Russian strategic bombers taking off all at once. I think the highest I saw was in the realm of 10 Tu-95s and 7 or so Tu-160s, along with a few ballistic missile-capable subs heading out into the Black Sea. Those bombers, for the majority of the war, haven't been used to bomb targets per se, but as aerial missile launch platforms. They take off and release their munitions all within Russian airspace, well out of the range of Ukrainian air defense systems. And with each bomber able to carry between 6 and 8 missiles each, plus the submarines, expectations were set a few nights ago for a barrage the size we haven't seen since the opening days of the war. But that's not what happened. It ended up being a total of 9 Tu-95s, 2 Tu-160s, and no submarines that launched a total of 18 missiles. Look, 18 missiles can cause a lot of death and destruction, and I believe 5 lives were lost in this attack. I don't want to downplay that, but the volume of fire there is just a little underwhelming, all things considered. So we're right back to the same debate about Russian capabilities. A fair argument here is that Russia used this as a way to draw out Ukrainian air defense systems that could be targeted then in a future strike. My counter would be that you don't need 11 strategic bombers to do that. I haven't really seen a solid argument yet as to why this large grouping of bombers was needed. Honestly, it's kind of confusing. Now, earlier that day, a Russian strike did occur in Pavlograd, Ukraine, quite a ways behind the front lines. The impact set off what appear to have been secondary detonations and resulted in a pretty significant fire. Early rumors coming out from this strike were that a large stockpile of Ukrainian air defense missiles had been destroyed in a warehouse or a rail line running through the city. But after more information started to come out, it appears as though the building was a chemical plant housing Soviet-era ICBM boosters. That tends to be where most folks have landed on the impact of that strike, and it was echoed by the Russian Telegram channel Rybar, but I wouldn't write this off as having no impact to the overall Ukrainian war effort. Pavlograd is a key juncture as Ukrainian forces head east towards the front in the Donbass. I have to imagine, by the size of the blast there, that the rail lines and logistics trail was at least a little bit affected. Given the focus on the expected Ukrainian counteroffensive, any strikes against logistics and transportation hubs will likely be a part of the Russian defense. For all the intel that Ukraine has been able to gather with NATO about Russian troop movements, it's safe to assume that Russia's done the same. Now, the accuracy and impact of that Russian intelligence is something we won't know for sure until after this offensive kicks off. Now, while all of this is happening, Ukrainian shaping operations are pretty clearly underway. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that fly under the radar, no pun intended, or that we don't really recognize until well after the fight has begun. But there have been quite a few recent events that are certainly tied in one way or another to near-term Ukrainian plans. There have been some pretty notable drone strikes in Crimea and now Moscow that I want to focus on. But first, just to show how widespread some of these events are, we turn to Igor Girkin. Girkin has a bit of a spotty track record, to put it mildly. He's a pro-Russian military blogger commenting on the war in Ukraine. Before this, he was in the Russian military, the FSB, and then led some of the separatist militias when the war kicked off in 2014. Anyways, in a Telegram post on May 3rd, Girkin outlined a few events that I would definitely call shaping operations. He talks about an airfield hit by drones in Bryansk, a fuel depot hit by the Kerch Bridge, which I'll talk about more here in a second, another fire in Leningrad, a gas pipeline struck in Kursk, and then lots of shelling across various areas of the front. And on top of what Girkin outlines here, there have been 2 train derailments this week in Bryansk, Russia, an area that borders Ukraine to the northeast. As we know all too well here in the United States, train derailments do happen, and those by themselves aren't necessarily a sign of a larger shaping campaign, but when considering the context, the timing, and the location, it's safe to assume that some sort of sabotage was involved here. Now on to the drone strikes, and there's a bigger story buried here that needs more attention. Ukraine is regularly conducting deep strikes in a way we really haven't seen so far in this war. 3 drone strikes occurred over the last 2 weeks in and around Crimea, and now one supposedly over the Kremlin. Now, the way shaping operations work is that it's not immediately clear why a strike or an action took place. So in this instance, I wouldn't say that the attacks in Crimea were in preparation for some Ukrainian assault on the peninsula, but perhaps a means of forcing Russia to pull air defense systems from elsewhere, relocate portions of the Black Sea Fleet, or depleting some of their much-needed resources. The first strike here didn't appear to do too much damage. This was the one where Russia said that all drones were shot down without incident. There were some detonations recorded, but that could also be the result of a drone falling out of the sky after being shot down. The second 2, however, were hard to ignore. On April 29th, Ukraine targeted a fuel depot in Sevastopol, which at its closest is 230 kilometers from Ukrainian-held territory. The pictures and videos from this strike were crazy. Kind of what you'd expect when a major fuel point is attacked. Massive flames, and it looks like it spread quite a bit before eventually being put out. Then on May 3rd, another few drone strikes. First was another fuel depot. This time it wasn't in Crimea, but just across the Kerch Bridge in the southeast portion of the peninsula into Russia. And in this case, the nearest Ukrainian-held territory was close to 300 kilometers away. Then we have the supposed Ukrainian attack on the Kremlin, which raises a lot of questions about Russian air defense in and around the capital, an area that is 450 kilometers away from the nearest Ukrainian-held territory. So what does Ukraine have that is capable of carrying out this style of attack? Recently, Russia released videos of downed Mugen 5 drones saying that they believe this is what was used to attack Crimea. The Mugen 5 is a Chinese commercial drone, so it's not as though China is supplying Ukraine all of a sudden with lethal munitions, but it is interesting that drones clearly being used in this war are somehow still permitted to be sold from China to Ukraine. Personally, I would have guessed that China would have shut that door quite a while ago. Anyways, the drone only costs around $10,000, has a 25-kilogram payload, 7 hours of flight time with a cruising speed of 120 kilometers per hour. Some rough math there means that this drone could potentially reach targets 840 kilometers away. Now, this comparison is apples to oranges in a lot of ways, but the ATACMS range is around 300 kilometers. This commercial drone is nearly triple that, and apparently Ukraine figured out a way to make it go boom. Now, the payload isn't very big, and the slow speed can make for pretty easy detection and interdiction by Russian air defense, but it's cheap, available, and that range is no joke. I mean, St. Petersburg is within range. That's crazy. And 25 kilograms of explosives would be enough to do some real damage to fuel depots, obviously, communications towers, and parked aircraft. These Chinese drones aren't going to be a super weapon or a war-winning piece of equipment, but it feels like we blinked and Ukraine now has viable strike capability well inside of Russian territory. And I would expect that we'll see it get more use in the coming weeks and months as shaping operations for the Ukrainian offensive continue to pick up steam. Now, one man who's watching this whole thing play out and doesn't appear to be very happy is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group. Prigozhin's been all over the map and has been a pretty interesting guy to follow throughout this conflict. On the one hand, his PMC has made more progress against the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut than any other Russian unit has in the last 7 to 8 months. But on the other, he's technically not a part of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and at times it shows. About a week ago, Prigozhin recorded a conversation with Wargonzo, a pro-Russian military blogger that came across as just a little bit panicked. First, he says that he expects Ukraine's counteroffensive to kick off in early May, maybe even on May 9th, to throw a little bit of a wrench in Russia's annual Victory Day celebration. Then he talks about, once again, being cut off from ammunition by the Russian Ministry of Defense. This was an issue he raised a few months ago that appears to have been pretty quickly resolved once he made the issue public. This time, he says Wagner cannot continue their assault of Bakhmut with what they currently have on hand, adding that more ammunition is needed or he's going to have to withdraw from the area so as not to be cut off and eliminated as a fighting force. He finishes by saying, quote, "We must stop lying to the population of the Russian Federation by claiming everything is okay." We have to take everything Prigozhin says with a grain of salt. He has personal and professional ambitions that stretch far beyond the battlefield of Bakhmut, and he's become a pretty vocal critic of the Russian military leadership. A few thoughts here. First, there's not a lot of evidence that Wagner is running low across the board on ammunition. It's been stated for a while now that they don't have that many anti-tank guided missiles, but everything else seems to at least be enough to maintain the current level of fighting in the city. Then again, it's entirely possible that their supply depots are running low and they're not being replenished. And if that's the case, based on the intensity of the fight, it's not crazy that they actually could run out. Now, Prigozhin came right back a few days later and showcased a warehouse full of weapons in Soledar, saying that he had enough to arm a 1,000,000-man force, but nobody would listen to him. He didn't say anything new about ammunition here, so it looks more to be suggesting that he has the weapons needed, he just needs the rounds to be able to use them. The interesting piece here is that this isn't a discussion of Russia running out of bullets and ammunition, but has the Ministry of Defense decided against letting Wagner keep growing and advancing? It's not something we have a lot of recent historical precedents to point to. Technically, private military companies are illegal in Russia, which puts Wagner in a tricky spot simply by existing. Add to that some of the recent claims about their war crimes and mistreatment of Ukrainian prisoners, and it's not out of the question that Russia could try to separate themselves from this, independent group. We've seen Prigozhin come out hot before. That's not really anything new. What's interesting here is that he sort of gave an ultimatum. Resupply us, or we're going to have to give up Bakhmut. In the past, his complaints have been that lack of supplies is costing them lives, and it's not clear if that is really of the utmost concern for Russian leadership. Now, I do think we have quite a ways to go before something of this magnitude would happen, but it puts both parties in an interesting spot. Prigozhin could just withdraw from Bakhmut, which would be a massive headache and political nightmare for Russia, but Putin and Shoigu could just cut Wagner off whenever they want and let the organization cease to exist after a few more weeks of intense combat. Worth saying real quick that Wagner is not just in Ukraine. They do have elements in Africa and the Middle East that have been there for a while, so even if the entire Wagner force in Bakhmut was killed or captured, it's not entirely true to say that the PMC would no longer remain. On the other side of this, there is some speculation that Prigozhin is trying to set the stage in the information space for Ukrainian success in the battlefield, specifically around Bakhmut. If Ukraine is successful against Wagner positions, he can now point back to these comments and say it's the fault of the Russian Ministry of Defense. They had the warnings. They failed to act, leaving his portion of the front exposed and susceptible to Ukrainian attack. Finally, there's some talk that this is just a big psyop by Prigozhin, an intentional deception to kind of lure the Ukrainians into a fortified battle space. It could be, but I don't think there's much value in that. Ukraine's plans for this offensive have been set and resourced for a long time now. They're not going to hear one public statement from Prigozhin and decide to change things up. The intel going into that decision is a lot more robust than what one guy puts out on social media. Now, of everything here, the Moscow drone attack is going to have my focus for a little bit. That's something where we could see some people inside of Russia try to leverage the event for further escalation of the war. So it's worth keeping an eye on, and I'll try to put something together when more information comes out. But that's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.